That's the $300 billion question. While everyone was engrossed in the $61 billion in aid to Ukraine, Congress quietly made a more intriguing move. Not in the Ukraine bill, not in the Israel bill, and not in the Taiwan bill, but in the nebulous Omnibus 4, which covered so many things that it was just easier for the media to let those details pass their ears. Hey, let's be honest, I'm guilty of that too. Excuse me. But the crux of the matter is the seizure of some $300 billion in Russian assets controlled by Western governments. It's a very touchy subject with serious implications for war. A super scientific poll of my viewers shows that most of you support this decision. But whether you are in that majority or minority, and whether you call it a seizure, confiscation, preventive reparations, or special banking operation, both sides often miss some of the subtleties of seizing or not seizing. Welcome to the paradoxical world, where capture will simultaneously cause more global instability and be a force for greater global stability. For those of us who have experienced this logical migraine, today on The Plan, we're going to look at exactly what these frozen assets are, what led to them, and how it happened, what the congressional bill did to tap into this pile of money, the problems that could arise with Russia's possible response to such a seizure, what it will do to the international financial system as a whole, why the West would get a hidden benefit from reducing the safety of foreign investment there, and we'll save the most interesting stuff for last with a discussion of the lines on the map and how the seizure undermines one of the West's key objectives in this war. But let's start with asset fundamentals. Let's look back a decade ago when Russia first entered and subsequently annexed Crimea. The West responded with what could be called light sanctions by today's standards. Nevertheless, it was enough to cause a noticeable financial crisis in Russia. Not enough to undermine Putin's position in the Kremlin, but enough to devalue the ruble from 36 to the dollar at the time of the annexation to 61 rubles by the end of 2014. Hence the so-called Fortress Russia strategy. It was the Kremlin's policy to create a rainy day fund of rubles and, more broadly, to ensure that the Federation's economy was protected from Western sanctions. The appropriate consequence for today is that the Russian central bank has accumulated $600 billion in savings by the time of the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Remarkably, about half of the money was in Western accounts. This may seem odd, given that the goal here is to keep Moscow safe from foreign coercion. Nevertheless, the Western financial system is so pervasive that it is difficult to place $600 billion without parking a significant portion in it. Perhaps some of it could have been withdrawn on the eve of the invasion. But remember that the Kremlin was counting on a quick win in the war, a quick overthrow of the Kiev government, so there simply wouldn't have been time to mount a Western sanctions campaign. On a side note, I know the uniqueness of this channel is that I can tell you what peer-reviewed international studies of conflict in our world today say. But in a way the opposite, I actually turned this video into a peer-reviewed article. There's a link to free access in the video description, and it's part of a larger symposium I organized on war. Lots more free reading to come, but no follow-up, I promise. Anyway, it's great that a video that has been viewed by almost 6 million people will now go into the peer-reviewed annals. I'm not sure anything like this has ever happened in any field, so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this kind of thing. Now back to the Kremlin's optimism. We all quickly learned that it was unjustified. Consequently, the Western financial system has frozen $300 billion. The money is still just lying there. Russia cannot access it. It is unclear, however, where the Kremlin would even go to get it. It is not clear exactly how much of that amount is distributed between the US and Europe. The bill mentioned suggests that the US only has $4.5 billion. The vast majority is in Belgium. France and Germany probably control the rest. However, since any future actions with the money are likely to be coordinated on both sides of the Atlantic, this particular detail may not matter much. It is also unclear exactly how much money we are talking about. There was $300 billion, but that $300 billion isn't just sitting in a vault somewhere. The funds are probably earning some kind of interest. Even with a conservative investment in one-year US Treasuries, it's now about 5% per annum. On the other hand, oddly enough, interest rates were close to zero at the beginning of the war. So at this point, we're not looking at $300 billion anymore. Nevertheless, it's more than $300 billion, And that very interest rate will become important later. That brings us to what is contained in the omnibus bill passed by Congress in April. Let's start with what it literally says. The key difference is that the bill authorizes a shift from asset freezing to asset seizure. So instead of Russia being blocked from accessing the accounts, the money will be transferred to another account. That way, Russia will never get a chance to get that money back because it will no longer exist. The bill establishes the following schedule. Within the first 90 days, Treasury must find out exactly how much Russian money the US controls and where it is located. Then, after another 90 days, Treasury must report to Congress on its findings. 1 month after that, the president can seize, confiscate, transfer, or take possession of the money. That will happen in November. By then, Biden will still be president, but within 2 months, it could be Trump. Regardless, whoever is in power will be able to take the Russian money and send it to Ukraine to compensate for the damage from the invasion. The bill also mandates that such measures must be taken in conjunction with the G7, the European Union, Australia, and any other parties holding Russian funds. This gives new importance to the upcoming G7 meeting to be held in Italy from June 13 to 15. On the surface, all this sounds like a plus for the West. However, the reality is more complex. Let's look at the main issues and analyze whether they are problematic or not. The first is the problem of mirror actions on the part of Russia. This has been the Kremlin media's main line of response. In general, if the US takes something away, Russia will take something away in return. The difference, of course, is the significant asymmetry of the sides. Investing Russian state assets in the West made financial sense. By contrast, Western countries did not particularly see Russia as an ideal place to store dollars or euros. Thus, Uncle Sam does not have a frozen piggy bank in Moscow that the Kremlin could simply rob in response to the confiscation of Russian assets. Consequently, the threat of retaliation is Russia confiscating the private assets of American, British, or European citizens, according to former President Dmitry Medvedev. The added layer of complexity here is that when that happens, the affected American citizens will undoubtedly sue the US government. Yes, Washington didn't take their money directly, but there is a clear causal link between the government's actions and the loss of funds. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to guess how this will all turn out in the end, but I can say that an injunction to confiscate frozen Russian assets may follow. Yes, that's 2 layers of ice, and if the court rules in favor of private citizens, Ukraine won't get a dime until those citizens are fully compensated. Everything will turn into a complicated redistribution of assets, benefiting no one. The second category of problems is that the Russian government is not a good place to invest. The US and to a lesser extent the EU have the advantage of being the de facto custodians of the world economy. This has a lot of intangible benefits, but I'll briefly describe one. You can borrow money denominated in your own currency. So, if you're the US and you urgently need to pay off a debt, you can always literally print money to pay for it. But imagine you're Argentina and you want to borrow money on the international market. Lenders will offer you dollars. You take the money, and when the due date comes, the lenders will have an expectation of receiving dollars in return. Consequently, if you don't have those dollars, you will have to go to the international markets to buy dollars to pay your debt. Finally, we get to the main event of the evening. It's time to cheer up a bit, because it's time to talk about the lines on the cards. Tonight's focus is on the problem of one-time costs, and this is where the game gets tricky. Let's get into the rules of the game and try to figure out who wins in the end. I mean costs that a country can only incur once and that are not reset over time. An attack on an oil refinery, for example, is not a one-time cost because Russia can repair the damage and then Ukraine can strike again. In contrast, asset confiscation is what would be a one-time cost. As ridiculous as it is to imagine that the Kremlin will call and buy more treasury bonds immediately after the West confiscates Russian funds, it won't happen. The basic problem is this. You have the standard white line, denoting the hypothetical territorial outcome of a war in the event of a military solution. And then you have Russia's red line, the gap between which reflects its costs of warfare. If you want Russia to retreat at least to the January 2022 borders as part of a final resolution of this conflict, then you need to push the red line back here somewhere. This can be done either by arming Ukraine to the teeth so that the expected outcome of the war is extremely favorable to Kyiv, or by piling so many costs on Russia that even a territorial outcome favorable to Moscow would still be a big net disadvantage. The problem with any one-time costs is that you can only impose them once, and if Western countries do it now, they can't do it again. Moreover, it's hard to imagine that confiscation could be reversed, because the money would already be distributed. Thus, after confiscation, it will no longer be a cost of war, but simply a fact of life that exists regardless of Russia's future military or peace decisions. But it does mean that Russia's costs from the continuation of the war to a military outcome are reduced, which means that the red line actually shifts further into Ukraine. As a result, for the purposes of pushing back the red line, it is better to threaten confiscation than to actually implement it, at least not until the military outcome of the war is realized. This is why the West froze these assets in the first place. They create bargaining leverage. To wrap up, I want to thank everyone for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. I hope you come back here many more times for more quality content. Take care and all the best.